Jamal Qureshi is the lead oil and refining trading analyst for Statoil, the Norwegian state oil company in Stavanger, Norway. While oil makers are Qureshi's specific professional niche, he considers participation in these markets an ideal perch for gaining a broader understanding of the interaction of markets, economics, politics, and the struggle of the developing world. His decade of professional experience includes having worked as the fundamentals analyst and hedge fund liaison at Hess Energy Trading Company in New York City, as on-desk fundamentals analyst for Barclays Capital Crude and Oil Products Transfer in New York City, and as the lead oil market analyst and consultancy at PFC Energy in Washington, D.C., in ExxonMobil's Public Affairs Division, and for the U.S. State and Treasury Departments. After spending a year studying Arabic on a Fulbright grant at the American University in Cairo, he went on to receive a Master of Arts in International Relations and Economics from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Pleased to say that Mr. Qureshi is a 1998 graduate of BYU with a degree in Near Eastern Studies from the Kennedy Center with an Arabic minor, having served in the England-London mission. Today he will be speaking on oil and the Middle East, poison or promise. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jamal Qureshi.
All right, so I apologize for being late. I guess there was a career fair today, so I think I ended up parking somewhere north of campus near Ogden or so, a bit of a walk. But that said, let's get right into it. All right, so for the topic today, actually one of the first things that had come to mind even before this was, I don't know if any of you recently saw, there were a lot of headlines about a major discovery of lithium in Afghanistan. And there were a lot of headlines being touted about, the potential this could help Afghanistan develop, and here's a resource they could finally have something to get their economy off the ground. And the point that I'm going to be making today is that that is not necessarily so. It's very conditional, the ability to take advantage of a large resource discovery on the prevailing conditions that are in a country when the resource is found. And it's very challenging, and my suspicion in a place like Afghanistan is it's more likely to be poison than promise. But it does vary very much depending on the conditions. So I just thought we could start out with the basic general assumption, of course, is that if you make a large oil or mineral discovery, the assumption is this is going to make a country rich. In reality, we have to consider a few things. First thing, how big of a population does the country have? How big is the discovery? And how is the country already governed and ruled? And we want to take a look at how these contexts have played out in some of the Middle East and North African oil producers. All right, so in the Middle East, who has the oil? And I just thought I'd throw up a few numbers just to give a general sense. And the first thing to keep in mind is that Saudi Arabia, whether on a reserves or production basis, always stands out. It's unique in the world. There is no other country that even comes close. They have by far the world's single largest oil field, the Ghawar field in the eastern province. And you can see here there's a map weighted by the size of exports. Countries are weighted by the size of their exports. Saudi Arabia, as you can see, dominates and stands out. More important, but not mentioned here as well, is that Saudi Arabia carries by far the bulk of the world's spare oil production capacity. In other words, if there's a sudden increase in demand, Saudi Arabia is about the only country in the world that can jump in and meet those increases. They can swing their production up and down. Up until about 1970 or so, the United States held that spare oil production capacity in the world. When that switched, the entire world oil market and the geopolitical consequences of it switched to a focus on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in general. And the other point I wanted to make was, okay, Saudi Arabia stands out on its own, but then the other large producers in the region, in particular, are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE. Libya is pretty large, Algeria is pretty large, but from there you're kind of going downhill. Population. One thing we have to keep in mind is that you can kind of throw the population of the Middle Eastern oil producers into three buckets. Those with a very large population, so here you're talking about Iran, Iraq. Egypt is a smaller producer, but they have the largest population in the region. Then you have countries that have basically none with large populations like Turkey. But among oil producers, you have a few of these large populations. Then you have some with small populations, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Libya as well. And then you have Saudi. Again, always a unique case. They have populations somewhat in the middle, but growing very rapidly, much bigger than the other small Gulf producers, so they have more needs. The other point is population growth rates in the Middle East are very large. Populations are growing very, very rapidly. The United Arab Emirates has, I think, the single fastest population growth rate in the world. But all of the Middle Eastern countries have fairly large rates. Even though they've come down, at this point only sub-Saharan Africa is growing faster than the Middle East. So their needs are rising. The needs that oil has to fulfill are rising quite quickly. So if you put this together and say, all right, I put together a chart. I said, all right, if we take the amount of oil that is produced in these countries per capita, and then say we make an assumption that there's $75 a barrel crude, about where the market's at these days, and probably a reasonable long-term estimation, even though it's going to be volatile. And if you do it on that basis, what do you see? Well, very quickly you see it's the small producers, the small population large producers, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, who are very comfortably well off. Saudi Arabia, by that point, you're starting to get down because, again, the population is very, very large, despite the huge production they have. And from there on out, it gets very small, especially from Iraq downwards. These are not dollar amounts that buy you automatic wealth for most of the large population countries in the Middle East. The needs are simply too great. So depending on the size of the population and the size of the production, you get very different challenges for the countries. Again, Saudi Arabia stands out as about the only large population, large producer. So what that's meant for the Saudis is that they've been able to buy off selected large chunks of the population. They can keep people employed in state companies, even if it's basically make work jobs. I mean, most industry that's been developed in Saudi Arabia has been very capital intensive and not labor intensive. There's not a lot of need for workers. And so because of that, instead, the deal in Saudi Arabia politically from the beginning has been to have an alliance with the clerics to basically say, fine, we will let you have your agenda in education, in promoting your brand of basically Puritan Islam around the world, and let you employ people doing that. So 50% of Saudi graduates from university graduate with Islamic studies degrees. And as much as that may be something they want, there's just not that much of a need for 50% of their working population to be clerics. So that's a problem. And then as the population grows, there's more and more of a difficult time being able to provide jobs, make work jobs, and basically buy off the populace. On top of that, large numbers of foreign workers. We'll talk a bit more about that, and you have to manage their expectations. If you're a small population large producer, it's much easier. You've basically bought yourself eternal wealth. Qatar and the UAE stand out for this. Kuwait was until they were invaded and had to spend a large chunk of their wealth rebuilding the country in the early 90s. But even so, they're fairly well off. Now, when you become a small producer at that point, you have to be much more selective. Whether a large or small population, you can get a boost to the economy, but you have to be more strategic in the investments you choose, hoping to be able to develop other sectors of the economy to be able to employ people. But a common question to all of them is, how are the oil earnings going to be controlled? Who's going to decide how to spend it? And in this case, the Middle East basically has had one answer, which is a small group of elites, inevitably corrupt, controls the wealth with basically no responsibility to answer to the populace other than riots and other sort of breakdowns of the system. So the term for that, as you may have heard, is what's called a rentier state. Economic rent, if you haven't heard the term, being basically the excess return beyond what you need to keep some good producing. So basically there's more money than you need to keep it producing, and there's rent to spread around. In that sense, oil's no different than any other what I call grabbable resource. And so that could be things like diamonds, natural gas, foreign aid, strategic rents. If you can convince foreign countries that, hey, we're important and you need to send us money, that's a rent. Cheap land. If you think about it in this way, the United States, up until about the late 1800s, was a rentier state. Why? It didn't cost very much to shove Indians off the land or to kill them and clear the land so that you could have Americans be able to go in and farm it, right? So it was a way of expanding the economy. And this has been done in many different countries with many different resources. So, but anytime you have excess revenue available, that invites corruption, unless there's really stringent safeguards in place. And you tend to get real extremes of power that result. Now, that can be highly concentrated, so you get that in places like pre-2003 Iraq, Equatorial Guinea, Russia, Chavez's Venezuela, or it can be very dispersed. Post-2003 Iraq or Nigeria is considered sort of the standard for this. The corruption is top to bottom in the system, just as it's become in Iraq since 2003. Another point to keep in mind is many of the states where oil and other large resources have been found were really in a very embryonic early stage of development. They were coming out of colonialism. They'd really been ravaged by the colonial powers who used these places essentially just to enrich themselves at the expense of the people who lived there. And so this meant that there were weak systems of control in place when oil was found. Very much true of the Middle East. Qatar as a country was basically created by the British to become a safe oil producer for them. It was to the point where the emirs of Qatar over and over got so fed up with trying to buy off the family that they would get themselves in debt and they would abdicate power, say, forget it, I don't want to deal with the family anymore, I don't care what the British want. They would just abdicate power and the British would pick another person to be in place. But slowly over time, these states have kind of coalesced into some form of state, but the corruption has mostly stayed in different forms. Yeah, so just to, again, give a picture of what a rentier versus an ideal normal state would look like. In your ideal normal state, the difference here is that you have a demanding populace, right? They provide politicians with their votes, with their taxes. The politicians are reliant upon the populace, in return for which the populace demands basic security, basic services to keep life going. And so you have a relationship that's symbiotic between the two. In a rentier state, that's not what happens. The money and the resources come in the top. And then the security, the guns, mercenaries, all those things which tend to be foreign are bought with those rents, and those are used to repress the populace or to provide patronage, some sort of basically bribe to the populace. So there's usually some combination of trying to keep the populace happy and trying to beat them down. And it has worked remarkably well in many countries over time from the ruler's perspective. So there's not been a lot of incentive to be able to switch the system as a result. Most states, of course, aren't purely one or the other. They fall somewhere in the middle. Talking about corruption, there's different models as I've labeled them. You can kind of think of a spectrum. On the one end, there's where I live, Norway, where you had a democratic system, a social welfare state. You had a very well-developed state in place with democratic norms and systems in place. So when the oil was found, there was a place to funnel them and keep control of most of the rents. There's hopes, for example, too, today that some of the new discovered oil producers in Africa might even be able to do this. Ghana, relatively speaking, for West Africa, has fairly well-developed state, reasonably well-functioning democracy. They've got their challenges, but the hope is that they can be able to learn from the success of places like Norway, who they've been consulting with, to hopefully be able to avoid many of these problems. You have problems with ordinary financial crime and Dutch disease, which I'll talk about in a minute, but basically that's a misallocation of resources away from productive industries towards just sort of speculative bubbles. In the US, we've made the corruption part of the system, right? You basically have an incentive, if you're trying to grab the rents, to go and lobby. So to give you an example, one of my first jobs, Enron had just collapsed, and we had all sorts of resumes coming into us. And we had one guy who had worked in Enron whose job was lobbying, and they had actually developed a matrix that said, okay, if we want to get X policy out of Congress, we have to spend X dollars, X number of dinners, X number of trips on congressmen to get them to produce the results we want, which will be worth X dollars. We actually had a system worked out for precisely how to do this, and it worked, and it was perfectly legal. The other piece of this, too, is that there's a very old piece of our democracy that's part of this, the Senate, right? Because the House, obviously, is based on population. If you want to get something out of the House, well, you've got to be able to apply to the majority. In the Senate, Iowa, Alaska have just as many votes as Texas, Florida, California, right? So there's a real incentive to go and be able to throw extra lobbying resources, extra dollars at the small states. And so it builds in, again, a system of corruption. Now, it's part of the system, though. It's definable, so it's nowhere near what the lower states have. Russia, if you look at Russia there you're in a situation where the state is picking corruption winners and losers. Yes, there's corruption at lower levels as well, but in general, this is the state saying we have a policy, we have goals for where we want to head, and so we are going to allow the resources to flow to those power centers that we want to have them. So this is where the Russian oligarchs come from. First under Yeltsin in a more chaotic process, and then under Putin in a more sort of thought-through, state-selected process, has decided who can be able to drive the resources of the state. This is why Yukos was crushed. Basically, the CEO of Yukos had decided he wanted to be an independent political player. The Kremlin was having none of that. They crushed him. They stripped his assets and spread them around to different companies as a result. Saudi Arabia is somewhat like Russia in that it's very much led from the top, but there's no guiding state strategy in the same way. So corruption becomes far more personal from the top. Patronage networks really flow from top to bottom. Nothing's allowed that wouldn't be permitted at the top if possible. So it's taking another step down from Russia. By the time you get to Iraq, before 2003, it was quite similar to Saudi Arabia. After 2003, it's been, again, top to bottom corruption. That's involved top political leaders, local level, mafia, militias, tapping energy supplies, things like that, and very much foreigners and ordinary citizens as well. The law was ripped out of the state in 2003. The entire state was dismantled, and corruption spread as a result because the oil essentially kept flowing. So the money was still there, but the systems to control it, such as they were, limited and corrupt, even those systems were removed, which basically put Iraq into a state very similar to Nigeria, where, again, the corruption is top to bottom, has been for years, has been a disaster for Nigeria. Nigeria per capita is poorer today than before oil was discovered. So if we look through the systems that we have in the Middle East that were there to sort of receive the oil rents as they started coming in, I sort of laid out some slides of different categories. I've got the whole Middle East here, but focus on just the oil producers. Socialist republics. That was sort of the dominant theme, especially coming through the ideological era of the 50s and 60s. In name, most of these countries remain socialist. In reality, there's a large state sector, but there's an increasing openness to the private sector. But Algeria, among the oil producers, stands out as the largest one. Libya still is as well under Gaddafi, although that's sort of I'm not quite sure what you'd call it. He calls it a mobocracy, if I remember Dill's translation right. But you also have smaller states, Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, well, smaller in terms of production as well. But all these states have tried to have state-guided economic development, and they've all failed at it. So the oil has not gone to do much good at the end of the day for these states' populaces and being able to employ people. Then you have what are often termed liberal monarchies. Liberal basically means you do what a Western government wants you to do. Among oil producers, you have Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. So Kuwait's by far the largest oil producer of those. Half of Bahrain's oil production, quote unquote, is really just a gift handed to them via a pipeline from Saudi Arabia. And Oman's a moderate-sized producer as well. The rulers have, again, they've done essentially as they please with the money, but they have tried to be relatively more responsive to people's needs. Kuwait is actually a very, very interesting case in that for historical reasons related to old merchant families, when the Gulf was more of a pearling and a trade center under the British, they actually have a reasonably robust parliamentary democracy in embryo. Now, the emir can dissolve it anytime he wants, and he has done that on frequent occasions. But at the same time, the parliament there has been able to have a vocal opposition that has even been able to question ministers and royals about oil policy and other sort of crucial state issues. So it's a back and forth. An interesting thing in Kuwait, too, is that the old Gulf system before oil was a very slightly populated place, and basically if communities didn't like the way the local ruler was treating them, they could and literally did from time to time pick up the whole community and just move to another place in the Gulf. And that power has sort of stayed, and the power of the merchant families that used to lead that has been a key for guiding that process in Kuwait. And as time's gone on, actually an interesting thing too has been that as the rulers have tried to undermine the opposition in the parliament, besides for dissolving the parliament from time to time, the other thing they've done is they've expanded the electorate. They basically say, hey, I can give these people the vote, and that will give me extra support, which might be a short-term, very cynical move, but in the long run, that's very positive for the development of a democracy. Then we have what I call pure rentier democracies, not democracies, monarchies. And again, notice where these are focused. Very much focused in the Gulf. The yellow ones were the old colonial era, so that's older. But to this day, still, they're there. I mixed sort of the liberal and the rentier ones. These aren't hard and fast categories. But the one that stands out the most, obviously, is Saudi Arabia. That's the biggest of them all. And there is absolutely nothing liberal about Saudi Arabia, that's for sure. Stands out unique in many, many ways. But it is interesting that there are so many monarchies focused in the main oil-producing regions. Western powers like dealing with monarchies. It's much easier than having to deal with democracies or populist states where you actually have to be responsive to the needs and the desires of the people. Just to give an example of this, there's a very good book I would recommend reading called America's Kingdom by Bob Vitalis. A history of the early relationship between Saudi Arabia and the U.S., sort of told through the eyes of the oil companies, Aramco, the state oil company, which was originally an American consortium. And he tells the story about how in the early days there was actually a lot of labor unrest. You had Saudi workers in the oil fields who basically were reading in the newspapers about the civil rights movement in the United States, about Rosa Parks on buses and demanding the right to be able to sit with the white people. And the Saudi workers were looking around and saying, those white guys from the States are riding around in air-conditioned buses and we're being dragged around in trailers. What's going on? And they started protesting. And the royals at first weren't sure how to deal with this. And the citizens were basically saying, they were protesting and saying, please, king, you're supposed to be our king, stand up for our rights. Aramco came in very forcefully and said, these guys are communists, you need to crush them, otherwise this isn't going to work, your whole system's going to fall apart, we're going to pull out. At one point, there was a labor protest in the eastern province where they actually took the leaders of the strikes up in a helicopter and dropped them on the strikers, killed them that way. And that crushed things pretty quickly. These monarchies do not respond to the needs of the populace except as crisis dictates. Islamic republics. We basically have two countries you could really call Islamic republics in the region. Iran and Sudan. Iran's a large producer. It came out of previously a quote-unquote liberal monarchy. Their system has been a mixture of trying to take the resources and favor selected classes. So you've had large state industries that were developed in an earlier era aimed at what's called ISI type industrialization, import substitution industrialization, basically trying to say, let's produce goods ourselves that we had to import before. And that's been a development process that has mostly died throughout the region. Iran keeps on pushing it, though, and they keep going for that. They also favor Republican Guard. The Republican Guard has become, I'm sorry, am I getting the term right? Am I mixing that up with something? The IRGC, basically an elite set of military forces that came out of the Islamic Revolution. They become a very, very large industrial and commercial power. So Iran always ends up being a very mixed picture. The deeper you dig into Iran, the more complicated it gets. It would be a stretch to say that they're genuinely responsive to popular needs, but it would also be a mistake to suggest that this is just a narrow set of elites with no sort of responsiveness to the population. It's a more mixed picture. Sudan, on the other case, has just been Iraq on many, many levels. They didn't really find oil until about a decade ago. As soon as they did, the money went straight into funding the military machine for fighting the civil war in the south, and more recently in the west in Darfur. It's been an unmitigated disaster for the country. And I think this is my last one, what I call sectarian mafia states in the region. The defining feature is sectarian or ethnic identity is the key determinant of access to resources and power, especially violence. Among oil producers, again, there's Sudan, which I talked about a minute ago, and Iraq has become this. Iraq has basically become the Lebanese civil war writ large, with massive oil revenues feeding the problems. It's a serious, serious problem, and it makes it almost impossible to step out of the cycle of violence or maybe you can step out of the cycle of violence, but once you do, you've done it by simply instituting sectarian identity, ethnic cleansing. That's basically why the violence has stepped down in Iraq, is because the ethnic cleansing succeeded. Okay, so that was the political side. What about the economic side? Development policy. The only ones that have somewhat succeeded in this in any real sense has been the small population, large producer states. They've succeeded mostly by importing the labor and the physical infrastructure to develop the country, to modernize them, but the citizens sit mostly idle. In many of these small states, the citizens are vastly outnumbered by the imported labor. But they've got state jobs, they can sit back the rest of their lives, they don't have to worry in several of these small states. Not all of them, but several of them are in that situation. Larger population states, they've tried to industrialize with the state leading the way. They have succeeded in providing basic health, education, transportation, energy needs. Basic. Much better off than they were under the colonial regimes. But they have not been able to produce the jobs necessary to employ a growing populace. And Algeria is probably the starkest example of that, and they got a decade of civil war out of it as well. Dutch disease I talked about too. This is only partially true in the Middle East case. The biggest oil producers don't have, when oil was discovered, Dutch disease basically says the currency will get stronger because everybody's buying your goods. When the currency gets stronger, your other goods that you were exporting before now become more expensive to the rest of the world, so those industries decline. Well, there really weren't many industries like that in the states, the oil-producing states before, so that's not really been as much of an issue. On the other hand, Dutch disease also says you're going to have investment in non-productive areas, and that's definitely been the case. You've had lots of land speculation and things like that, stock market speculation. Money hasn't gone into terribly productive areas. Guns, weapons. The region is seen as extremely strategically important to outside powers, primarily due to oil, and that's resulted in a large buildup of arms to secure those resources and to spark proxy wars for influence and power. Yemen has been a clear case of that, Lebanon, Iraq. So huge amounts of money have been wasted on weaponry, much of which has been really ineffectual. I mean, the Saudis are some of the largest arms buyers in the world, and they can barely use them. And then labor flows. This has been the hugest one. I want to focus on that a bit more in a minute. The way the populations of the region have been shifted and the economics have been shifted by labor moving to go work in these producing states has been one of the largest impacts on the region. Just a quick note on the arms sales I thought worth pointing out. This is the recent, I don't know if you've seen this, Saudi arms deal with the U.S., $60 billion plus. UAE has also got a large $30 billion and several others as well. But put this into a global context. If you look at the bottom chart there, I mean, typically global arms, well, actually, sorry, go to the left one first. Typically Gulf arms sales have been, sort of $3 to $5 billion a year. Well, over the course of 5 years here, what are we talking? We're talking $10 to $15 billion a year from Saudi alone. You're going to hugely increase those Gulf purchases. Put that into a U.S. context where you get about $10 billion a year. Again, you're easily going to be doubling the sales of arms by U.S. arms manufacturers. And U.S. arms manufacturers have been very smart in spreading out their production throughout the country. There's hardly a state in the country that does not have a major arms producer. And do you want to be the senator that said, I voted down this arms package and cost jobs in my district, in my state? Not likely. So these arms sales are going forward. They're extremely wasteful for the Gulf. They're aimed primarily at satisfying a U.S. and Israeli desire to be able to block in Iran. The populaces of the region aren't particularly concerned, frankly, about Iranian nuclear weapons. The rulers are. Okay, but back to labor migration. I think this is one of the most important issues that doesn't get understood as an impact on the region. And this has come in several ways. Well, first of all, because the large population countries in the region have not been able to provide jobs, when oil producers needed workers because they simply had a shortage as the oil was developed and they needed to build infrastructure, the simplest thing for the other governments, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, places like this, Yemen, to do was simply let people go. So this became actually a very free market segment of the region, whereas there hasn't been much else in actual development of business. So the labor started to flow. Before 1974, most of the labor flowing into the Gulf was Arabs, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, these areas. The wage differentials between the Gulf and the countries weren't that big yet, so they weren't attracting a lot of workers from other regions, but the workers were very skilled coming from these other countries. There was relatively high levels of education among the workers coming. This is a period that I would recommend reading Abdurrahman Munif's book, Cities of Salt. It's a fictional work, but does a very good job of capturing this period. It was a real period of turmoil and turnover, but it started to raise wages in the region. 1974 to 1990, you had the first oil boom moving. Now you got a lot more poor workers coming in, a lot more from Sudan and Yemen who are at the lower end, Egypt as well. It's estimated 8 to 10% of the Egyptian labor force is working abroad at any given time. I mean, it's a huge chunk of the population. But that really helped build the first wave of modern infrastructure in the Gulf. And then 1990, though, is where things really started to shift. In the late 80s, the infrastructure development program started to really scale back to begin with already. There was less oil money coming in as oil prices collapsed. In 1990, you had huge expulsions of workers. Any state that supported Iraq saw their workers expelled from the Gulf. So Palestinians were out, Yemenis were out. You had hundreds of thousands of Yemenis thrown back into Yemen. When the Yemenis voted against some of the UN resolutions, U.S. diplomats came to them and said, that's the most expensive vote you ever made. And hundreds of thousands of Yemeni workers were thrown out of work and sent back to Yemen. You also, though, had, after that point, Gulf governments who were now getting very nervous about having potentially politically active Arabs among them that they had started expelling. So they started both trying to nationalize their workforce, get more locals to work, and bringing in more Asians, Indians, Filipinos, Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, getting them to do the work because they presumably were less politically motivated. The last stage, sort of the mid-90s to the present, is where things are maturing, so to speak. You have large labor populations already in place. The labor flows are slowing down, and basically the ability to keep sending workers from places like Egypt is waning. Impacts of labor migration. Well, for individuals and households, if you're a poor Egyptian worker, it makes a lot of sense to go. You make more money. On the sending countries, there's been an argument that you're starving them of necessary labor and stunting their development. The evidence doesn't seem to suggest that. It actually suggests that because you had such a large pool of workers available, you were simply removing some of the excess, taking them somewhere where they could earn more money, and there were plenty of people still able to fill the jobs that were available, not that many, at a slightly higher income. So this has actually been argued that it's actually done a lot to help develop some of the rural areas of the Middle East. Remittances, very important. When the workers send their money back to the countries that they're from, that brings in foreign exchange, which can pay for imports, food, fuel, capital goods for industry, things like that. It's been very, very important. It's been more important than foreign direct investment. It's been more important than foreign aid. Large chunk does get spent on short-term consumption, but also upgrading things like the housing stock, which helps improve people's houses. If you're going from a mud hut to, a brick house, it's a great improvement. All right, when the workers returned, there's been a couple different ways things have happened. When workers were expelled from the Gulf, for example, and went back to Yemen, to Jordan, there was actually temporary booms in consumption, in real estate markets, construction, things like that, but or Iraqi workers after 2003, but very quickly the money runs out. And all of a sudden now you've got a lot more workers back in these countries, and they tend to be more experienced older workers, which means the young workers coming up into the system now have to compete with more experienced people. And it basically just balloons the pool of workers in countries that don't have a lot of job opportunities to begin with. Or else, if not, then refugees oftentimes will just be shoved out of the system. Like in Lebanon, Palestinians are not allowed to work in most jobs. The other key issue is the cultural side. And a lot of workers go to the Gulf, and they come back. The Saudis call their version of Islam al-Islam bila tawaif, Islam with no sects. They try to make it sound like it's very universalist, we're all the same, we're all Muslims. In reality, it's a very, very stark Puritan version of Islam. The Puritans are probably the best example I've come up with for that. So you get these very Gulf religious, cultural attitudes that come back, and it really has changed a lot of the culture in different countries. I've seen this in my own family. My father's Pakistani. He's remarried. His kids, they're all sort of grew up half between Saudi and the U.S., and their version of Islam is very, very stark. I mean, I end up having to talk to my sisters and brothers half the time and tell them, you do realize this is not the way Islam was in Pakistan, before everyone went to the Gulf. People worshipped saints. People had lots of different sects, lots of different beliefs. They were much more liberal in their outlook. This is very much a Gulf effect. This is Saudi Islam. This is not necessarily the Islam that your country developed. Net effects, well, positive. This did allow rapid development of the infrastructure and education networks in the Gulf. They couldn't have done this without the skills of these workers. On the negative side, citizens really basically got used to never having to do manual labor. And also you get this weird situation where some of these states have more foreign laborers than citizens. And those numbers of foreigners worried the rulers, especially the monarchs of these developing states, that they were going to face political unrest as a result. And so they started clamping down on workers. So they would basically say, you come here, we take your passport. You're completely vulnerable. You're at the mercy of your employer. You can be not paid, you can be thrown out, you can be beaten, you can be raped. All these things can happen, and you have no recourse. And it happens on a regular basis to this day. There's some changes occurring in this. Bahrain removed the worker sponsorship system. Kuwait just announced that they're going to. At least after 3 years, you won't be reliant on your one employer. But it was a system that was designed to ensure that the workers could be kept under control and at the mercy of the state. First via the employers, and if that didn't work, then the state also has developed extensive security, secret police apparatuses to control people as well. So that's not exactly been a positive development, and they bring in foreign soldiers as well, often Pakistani, in the past Omani as well. Qatar and Bahrain had disputes over some islands, what was it, the Hawar Islands, I think they were called for many, many years. They almost went to war once, I think it was in the 70s, and the rumor was that they were getting ready to go to war. They had their air forces lined up, the F-15s fueled up, ready to go. And suddenly, all the pilots on the Qatari and the Bahraini sides realized they were from the same part of Oman and they didn't want to fight. So that's what happens when you get very different dynamics. Pakistanis, for that reason, are preferred, and they've been used throughout the region. Even in Jordan, Black September, when the PLO was crushed, it was Zia-ul-Haq, who later became the Pakistani dictator and really sent Pakistan on a downhill slide. He was in charge of the forces that crushed the PLO in Jordan. You also have large communities now of permanent residents who don't really feel a part of the country or quite part of the countries they came from. In the Gulf, it really is a Jim Crow system. It's back to the 50s in a lot of places for a lot of workers. Again, I would recommend reading Bob Vitalis's book, America's Kingdom, on that. He really goes into the history of it and shows actually the origins of the labor system in the Gulf did come from the Jim Crow era. American companies had grown up, they'd had Jim Crow in the Arizona copper mines, they'd segregated Native Americans and Latino workers from white workers, played divide and conquer between the workers. They took that system to Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela, then they brought it to the Gulf. When the Saudis protested, the royals instead just instituted the system. They said, okay, fine, we're going to slowly move our workers into a positive segment of that system, but we're still going to discriminate against the other workers. That's precisely where the system came from, that and British labor rules under colonialism. Just a quick chart to show it's a little bit messy, but the idea here is if you look, this is net migration, and you can see the inflow countries have been steadily reducing. It's a noisy series, but in general, there's not as much room for the workers to keep going. The outflows now are trying to go to Europe, but even there, it's difficult to find the same kinds of jobs. Basically, the Middle Eastern countries with large populations can no longer rely on the Gulf to take their workers. So, final conclusion, well, the region needs to develop. It needs to be able to provide sustainable employment for its people. Oil rents have helped do this to some extent up to now. They provided job opportunities in the Gulf, but they've not been building sustainable alternative industries anywhere. There's been some attempts, haphazard back and forth, but it really hasn't worked to date. Governments have been spending vast sums of money on arms, wars, on their own and at the behest of U.S. and in the Cold War at the behest of the Soviet Union as well. And now it's sort of more regional powers as well. They've also got their own corruption and no responsibility to their people. So to date, oil has been, it can definitely be said, a net gain for raising the immediate living standards of the region, both in the oil-producing countries and in the countries that many of the workers came from, where remittances were sent back and wages were raised. But the next phase of development is going to require governments be much more focused on people's needs. And that is going to be a very big challenge because the current arrangements don't provide for that. The political systems are not set up for that. If political change doesn't come to match those needs, that's when oil really becomes a true curse. One could argue it has been already in some aspects, but there's been positives to offset it. That may not continue if the political systems can't adjust. So you need political change that can accommodate that kind of sustainable economic growth and development that can take different forms. There can be benign dictatorships, or there could be more democratic leanings. The odds are there's going to be a mixture throughout the region. Asia has definitely become a model that a lot of people in the Middle East watch. People don't really look to Europe and the US for their models as much as they did in the past. They're looking much more to Asia. They're seeing what the Asian tigers did, and they're especially seeing what the Chinese have done. The Chinese have become a major and growing force in the economics and politics of the region. That's going to continue. So, with that said, I will open the time up to any questions.
These are two questions that are unrelated, but the time that I spent in the Gulf, I have felt that a lot of the people are actually serving in slavery. Would you call it that? And the other question has to do with the Arabic language in the smaller states of the Gulf. I was just at a conference where Arabs were screaming bloody murder that the Arabic language is dying and that they were killing it themselves. Do you agree with that, and do you think it's a concern, or it's one of the things that gets crushed in this kind of a system?
As far as the laborers, yeah, I mean, there are vast numbers of people for whom slavery, maybe indentured servitude, as in the old colonial system, might be a more precise definition. But it's not far off slavery, absolutely. I mean, as far as language, I mean, the pidgin Arabic is certainly widespread, but I mean, you talk to Gulfies, certainly, and certainly doesn't seem like it's dying there. It seems very dynamic, as in any other country, is my view. I mean, I'm not a linguist like you, but my perception has certainly been that that's an overplayed concern.
On that point, just follow up, you're talking about, are you talking to young Gulfies, who are going to foreign schools? And I mean, we see this, for example, in Egypt, the movers and shakers who are at AUC and who are not really very good. I mean, look around the Arab world, right? I mean, the king of Morocco, the king of Jordan, neither of them has a really good handle on Arabic.
Yep, no, that's true. But I mean, let's keep in mind, these are pretty small crust segments of the population, right?
That's what the Gulf is, right?
Yeah. But in the Gulf, though, the difference there, too, though, is, I mean, if you go to a place like, say, American University of Sharjah, places like that I have been, the Gulfies very much stick to their own cliques versus even other Arabs, right? There's a definite division there, and the Gulf students very much, they're speaking in Arabic. Yes, they have the mobile phones and they throw in some words, but their grasp of Arabic that I've seen, my experience, anecdotal, has been not like AUC. That's been my personal experience, at least. Yep.
Okay, my name is Denise, and I'm a Mesa major from Southern California. Since I am from Southern California, I see a lot of similarity with the problem we're having there with illegal workers coming from Mexico. Why there are so many now, why it's gotten that way. It seems like a lot of the problems in the Middle East with the oil are kind of the same, a lot of the same problems we've had with, being so liberal in California. And now we seem to have the same problem. I was wondering if you saw that correlation.
Well, I mean, the key similarity is wage differentials. As long as there's a wage difference, workers will want to come, right? And the other key issue is, why does that wage differential open up? In the Gulf, there were not workers to do those jobs, and it's very much the same case in the U.S. There are not workers willing to take those jobs, and therefore the workers will come. You can try to throw up as many walls as you want. The workers will come if the jobs are there and the wage differentials are big enough. People want to improve their living standards. That's what will happen.
The New York Times did a feature a couple months ago about Qatar, and I don't know if that's how you say it, but the huge amount of foreign workers that are there as opposed to the native Qataris or whatever they are. My question is, how long will it take, or in your opinion, how long will it be before those workers actually are able to work for their own rights? Because at some point, don't you think that they'll have to be politically active and get a response from the government?
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing question. I think the short-term answer is it's not going to happen. The system can sustain itself for some time. There's a deal, basically. You stay quiet, you will earn a lot more money than any other possibility you have, and people are basically willing to take that deal. But it is an ongoing question. You would think at some point, the demographic face of the Gulf has been completely changed. I mean, it is just as Asian as it is Arab at this point. If in many cases it's more Asian than it is Arab, especially in the smaller states. So that's causing changes, and the real question is, it would be nice to say that democratic change and a new sort of vision of citizenship is inevitable. I'm not so sure it is. These rulers can continue to play off different populations. If one set of workers becomes politically active, you kick them out, and you bring in another set who's willing to work for you. It's been done over and over through many, many years and generations. Even if you have a more democratic system that evolves, populism and the citizens who already have their rights are not necessarily going to be eager to share the resources they have with a whole new set of citizens. So I'm not sure it's so inevitable, even though on the surface you would think it might be or hope so.
You talk about decreasing corruption and providing more for the needs of the people. What kind of infrastructure do you see possible in the Middle East for furthering economy once oil supplies begin to dwindle and things like that?
I saw a quote the other day, anonymous Saudi saying, "My grandfather drove a camel, my son drove a car, I ride a plane, my grandson will ride a camel again." This is the problem. Can you develop industries for the future? Saudi is going off now on a huge kick to try to develop a set of industries that can employ people more, which is the first time they've really done this. They're building these, they call them economic cities, that are supposed to provide large amounts of employment. The problem is they're all based around oil as a cheap feedstock. So that raises the question whether or not even that is sustainable in the long run. Now, you do have some of the smaller states, which in theory can manage even after the oil is gone. It's probably not true now with the increase in oil prices, but in recent years, the UAE has been earning more money off of its foreign investments than it has off of its oil sales. They've bought themselves eternal wealth. The Qataris have done the same thing, although in their case it was mostly natural gas. They have the world's largest natural gas field offshore, North Field, Qatar, and they basically put themselves in deep, deep debt for several years to build liquefied natural gas export facilities. Now they're making money off of it. They're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and they will be forever. But this can be vulnerable too. If you're relying on financial assets, the Kuwaitis learned this. When the Iraqis invaded, trashed the country, they had to rebuild the thing. They were very much in that eternal wealth situation before. They had to go, if you look at the statistics for government expenditure, it was like 250% of GDP for a few years. They had to spend a big chunk of their wealth for a while to pay for that. So financial reserves aren't necessarily as secure as some people might think. The challenge is there. They have not developed those economies. They need to find industries in which they have real competitive advantage. And I would say that's not just for the oil producers themselves, but obviously the Egypts and the other countries like that have been reliant on sending their labor to those countries. And, at this point, things are very, very stuck. People are looking for a new opening. The assumption is that you have to be more open to the global economy. Nobody's really found a good way to develop an economy into a modern political economy without essentially making stuff for other richer countries to buy. And the Middle East is not very good at doing that economically so far. The hope is that they can develop into that situation, but they're not there at this point.